to our presentation. Unfortunately, my co-presenter couldn't be today, but he did play a big impact on this presentation. So the topic I will be talking about today is bridging the gap between critiquing society and social change. So I just wanted to go over how the slides will be presented and go over kind of the themes and the major concepts within this presentation. So I'm just going to read through them. The first part will be about Habermasian social theory. I think that really informs how we look at action-based research and other forms of action-based research, which I will be covering. And then we go to critical theory, how critical theory relates to research, the researcher's positionality, from action research to community-based participatory research, critical theory, and community-based participatory research, and then reflecting on your research identity. So if you look at this overview, all these concepts kind of interrelate, but I'll go through them separately before I show you how they relate to each other. Okay, so I wanted to start with a quote. A lot of this presentation is influenced by the Frankfurt School, who really were the front runners of critical theory. And so although I'm not utilizing Horkheimer as my main reference or foundation, I did want to add him in because they were the developers of critical theory. And that is, the task of critical reflection is not to merely understand the various facts of historical development, but to also see through fact itself in its development and therefore its relativity. I think this quote indicates the relationship between critical reflection and what truth is. A lot of the time when we look at truth or we look at it through the scientific method, we often think objectivity. However, this quote presents the relationship that truth is actually more related to relativity in terms of how is truth developed, or how do we come to know what is true. So that's kind of the main overarching theme of this presentation. So I just wanted you to hold that in mind in terms of understanding truth through its relativity. Okay. I'm sorry if you can't see this that clearly because the font, but I'll try to go through it so that you understand it all. So, as I said earlier, critical theory was developed by the Frankfurt School, which included both Habermas and Horkheimer, and other important theorists and social philosophers include Adorno and Erich Fromm. So they started as a group of thinkers who created critical theory in order to critique society, but also critique the social constructs in which we inhabit in through institutions or other forms of agendas. So critical theory now extends to understanding phenomenon in seeking what informs its design and interpretation. And what I mean by that is, I know in the political scene we've heard a lot about critical race theory and other forms of critical theories, but there hasn't really been a foundation as to what it is, and there's been a lot of misinformation. So I kind of want to deconstruct that and talk about how critical theory is basically a critique to understanding the historical data that can be seen as objective fact or objective history. So one thing that informs critical theory was Habermas's social theory. And his social theory is embedded within critical theory and focuses on language, on communication as the basis of constructing knowledge. So differently to paradigms such as positivism, which kind of says that, okay, we can know truth from mathematical equations and that truth is objective, Habermas proposes that language and how we talk and how we interact is how truth gets constructed. And I don't mean by language in the terms of someone individually using language, but language in the sense of how it is developed relationally. Habermas utilizes the concept of rationality in terms of seeking truth through either instrumental rationality or communicative rationality. So that builds on this notion of truth, because his idea of emancipation or through research is that instead of instrumental rationality, which can be defined as what positivism uses, or instead of finding instrumental truth through strategy and objectivity, we find true rationality through communicative rationality. And as I said before, communicative rationality is the framework that it exists in is through two people discussing something, interacting in order to get to a certain rationality that makes sense for both people or both groups. And so he comes up with a theory of communicative action. Central to his social theory is understanding how capitalist modernization is a form of one-sided rationalization, instrumental, which focuses on the agenda of institutions and monetary gain. So when we come to understand instrumentalist rationality, it isn't only through positivism, but understanding, for example, the paradigm we live in. The way institutions work is under a capitalistic paradigm. Therefore, when we look at it, it only shows one side. It does not show the other side, how people who are not put into the equation suffer from capitalism. Because in the grand scheme, there is this generalization that capitalism is good for society, but is it really? Because that's only one side of the coin. And then in terms of research, Habermas aims to go beyond positivism, instrumental reality, to utilize communicative rationality and utilize research as a form of emancipation. So if we look at instrumental rationality and communicative rationality again, we can understand that through positivism, it isn't really a form of interaction and coming to a truth with people. It's more so an individual process that aims to control what we are observing versus allowing truth to come up naturally. So I just wanted to reiterate both these concepts because I know I talked about them a lot, so just to provide the definition. So communicative rationality is achieving consensus through argumentation and interaction, the use of knowledge in language and action versus rationality being a property of knowledge. So I think an example would be the dialectical method, where it's a back and forth of like, how do we deconstruct this? What is the meaning of this? But it's not come up from one's consciousness, but from interactive consciousness and interaction. And then just to highlight instrumental reality, again, it is political and economic imperatives to achieve desired outcome, using rationality to maintain power structures which undermines knowledge being created. So again, if we look at certain social constructs such as capitalism, there is a specific outcome such as wealth generation that we want to achieve versus allowing whatever is happening to be discovered. So his social theory continued. When coming to understand communicative action and communicative rationality, Habermas introduces the concepts of communication, colonization, and deliberation. So again, within his social theory of understanding communicative rationality of this interaction between people and how that can turn into action, we have to understand these three concepts in order to understand what communication is, how colonization deters communicative rationality, and the antidote to colonization, which is deliberation. All these interrelated concepts are utilized in Habermas's social theory to inform the dangers of modern society and views on how to progress towards communicative rationality. So kind of summing up what I just said. So Habermas's social theory can also be applied to research, as it also has the goal of progressing past the goal of positivism with the goal of emancipation. So I think a huge goal that we need to think about is the difference between doing research with the goal of emancipating a specific community or group versus, again, trying to control the outcome to get a desired outcome to somehow frame society or social institutions the way the specific researcher wants to. So instead of finding a solution, looking at how research designs are embedded within the wider and political processes situate research as a tool of emancipation. So instead of looking at what we're trying to research, it's how we're trying to research it and critiquing that. So a really important concept also within his social theory is life world, because that is separated from the instrumental rationality that happens within society. And that the definition of that is the interpersonal social life of those who are affected and inhibited by power. So looking at how those who are not within the dominant group who has the power to make those decisions, such as a researcher, or if we look at it in the context of a researcher and a participant, we would originally think, oh, the researcher has all the power. So in that situation, the participant would be someone who is also affected, but not necessarily taken into consideration aside from what the desired outcome of how they are being utilized. So I wanted to go back to the three concepts that I mentioned in the last slide because I think they will it'll help understand how they inform his social theory even more. So when we look at communication, it focuses on the intersubjective dimension of social interaction. So instead of subjective, which relies on the individual and their consciousness, the intersubjective allows for two separate consciousness to interact with each other. So allowing, for example, if me as the researcher and the participant have different ideas, allowing both that subjectivity to come together and interact. Engage in rational discourse to reach consensus and establish norms. So that goes into the idea of subjectivity of finding consensus versus the one with more power dominating the conversation. The primacy of language over consciousness from isolated self to using language to interact. So again, that focus from the subjectivity of an individual to intersubjectivity. So colonization is what deters, again, communicative rationality from happening. So the pursuit and maintenance of state political agendas and the way in which capitalism exploits avenues for wealth creation. And although these are large concepts that really affect all of us, I really want to emphasize how these two notions affect the process of research and understanding how research maintains political agendas, and even as the researcher gaining, having the monetary motivation in order to do more research. So both these processes destroy the communication fabric, which I emphasized earlier as the intersubjective interaction. This is, colonization is achieved through strategy and instrumental rationality over communicative action. So again, if we look at colonization in the general term, in a general way, it's a specific group imposing their values, their culture on a specific group. So again, when we look at it through the lens of research, it is coming from the idea of trying to be the golden rule, such as the scientific method, in order to colonize research processes. And then the antidote to that would be deliberation, which is which goal is being the ideal speech situation. This ideal speech situation was formed by Habermas and offers the possibility of rational consensual basis for interaction free of force, open or latent. So the goal of the research process within the ideal speech situation would be able to acknowledge the power relationships, the privilege within that process, and be free of them through deliberation. And all communication and truths are up to being deliberated on whether they are true and sincere. Okay. So from social theory, we go to critical theory. I see the social theory as informing critical theory. I know I touched a little bit upon it, but now we're going to expand on it. So Habermas's social theory can be understood as a form of critical theory because it looks at the institutions and the paradigms of which we exist in. Any form of thought that aims to critique and challenge the existing power structures that not only exploit, but other marginalized groups in society. And I think that's where a lot of the misconception of what critical race theory does and how it's presented in the media, because in the media it presents it as, oh, for example, race shouldn't be looked at in an ahistorical way or a historical way. But it's any school of thought that aims to critique and challenge anything, whether that be race, class, or sex. Any of it would be considered critical theory under the umbrella of critical theory. Critical theory includes theories such as critical race, but is the broader umbrella of theories that challenge any underlying power structures and social constructs. It can be categorized as a form of theorizing motivated to address social justice and develop more just situations for all. So one of the core values of critical theory is almost an action-based theme, where you are trying to address the injustices that are happening within a group and to develop more just situations for all. But in order to do that, it's important to go back to the idea of communicative rationality, because then the researcher and participant relationship can no longer exist as a hierarchical relationship, but must have more of a lateral relationship. So critical implies the critiquing of existing conditions and how these conditions may be unjust or exploitive. And these conditions don't always refer to physical conditions. They can also refer to invisible ones, such as social constructs. Okay, so now I made this chart so it kind of helps move how they all relate to each other. So critical theory would be analyzing power structures and social contradictions. And then how it relates to research is that research is looking at what maintains those power structures. So instead of, a lot of research has to do with, for example, what are the outcomes of CBT, or what are the outcomes of this? Research, action-based research, or which is informed by critical theory, is more, how does CBT, or how does any theoretical modality perpetuate a specific power structure or a specific positionality? And so when we use that type of research to understand how we're situated in, we then go to emancipation, which is the objective that can be achieved through the medium of research. And now we go to the researcher's positionality. I know the theme of this conference is practice-based evidence, and even though this presentation isn't based specifically in therapy, as therapists, we are also researchers. So it also does play a role in how we interact with our participants and how we conduct research in order to emancipate our clients or to emancipate our participants. So the researcher's positionality is how we situate ourselves within the research process. How research is conducted is just as important as what is discovered in a study. So we can look at it as either the detached researcher, which we see a lot, for example, in psychoanalysis, when the psychoanalysis is taking place, it's kind of him just sitting there, him in control of the situation while the client is there, and he is trying to control the situation by producing insights. So then there's also the integrative researcher. So I made these categories in order to help you understand more what I'm talking about. So with positionality, there's the outsider neutrality versus inability to truly understand, or insider capacity for greater access versus potential for bias. So the reason I wrote that is a lot of the time we like to categorize things as black or white. I am this or I'm not this. But even when I did that, for every type of researcher you are, there is a bias that exists within it. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, and also acknowledge that we don't have to be either or. We can be able to acknowledge that we are both an outsider and insider. And I think a good example of that is, for example, when we're working in communities that we are not necessarily a part of, that would be an outsider. Or for example, if we are producing research for a specific academic institution, we may feel like an outsider. But if we were to be part of that community, it creates a nuanced context of where we are both insiders and outsiders. So understanding the positionality of a researcher representing centers of power and privilege within institutions and production of knowledge. So interest convergence is a concept about doing research where both the interests of the participants and researchers are taken to account. So evaluating the researcher's interests and whether they overshadow the interests of the participants. Issues of power. I keep coming back to this because issues of power can happen on so many levels, whether it be within the paradigm you're working within, but also within the power relations between the participant and the researcher. So relational issues of power that develop as tensions of different motivations. improvement for our own privilege or others. And I think that's a really important part to bring up, because even as we're sitting in this conference right now, why are we here? Or why am I doing this presentation? Is it to exert my own privilege of how I exist within these academic institutions, or am I doing it to help others? And those can both exist, but I think they both need to be noted and talked about. So having the reflexivity to access foreseen, unseen, and unforeseen dangers. So just to give more of an idea of how we can reflect on our positionality as a researcher, I've listed these types of dangers that can happen during the research process. So seen dangers, consequences that can be deduced from the researcher's decisions. So for example, if I know I'm just doing this research, even by picking the type of research to kind of advance my own career, that would be a seen danger, because I know that, but I'm still conducting the research. And then unseen dangers, hidden or invisible dangers during the research process. So unseen dangers could be seen as almost different things, but for example, cultural differences. We may not know how someone's cultural positionality could affect the research, and we might not know till the research happens, but it's still important that we be reflexive in that process in order to understand. And then lastly, unforeseen dangers. Unpredictable outcomes of the research that the researcher is not aware of. Utilizing collaborative partnerships to, that was the last, but there's, unlike unseen, unforeseen dangers is when dangers come up that happen that we did not know that would happen. For example, me and the researcher and the participants start conversing about motivations, and we thought we had the same motivation for the research, but we don't. Or even in terms of aftercare or integration after the research process. An unforeseen danger would be, how does the researcher doing affect the community you're in, even after the research? Because your job as a researcher is not only to do the research in a critical theory paradigm, but to also take care of the participants you're working with. And lastly, a way or an antidote, or one antidote to do that, is utilizing collaborative partnerships to achieve health equity. And to continue, so understanding the insider-outsider etic-emic relationship within researcher positionality, the role of working within a community or working within an academic institution, co-constructing or appropriating knowledge. So I discussed earlier how a researcher could be both an insider and outsider, but I think to emphasize this, I also like to use the concepts of etic and emic. So etic is being part of the culture that you are researching and not necessarily being neutral, but being involved in the cultural framework, versus being emic, where you are an outsider and you're kind of trying to generalize knowledge, which can sometimes be problematic, because although there are similarities within cultures, it can be presumptuous to say that these are true of all cultures. So I think it's important to remember that and understand that they can both exist. So looking at societal and achieved identities, for example, cultural identity versus academic identity. So even within the research process, and I think this can relate to us being a therapist, sometimes we're also caseworkers, sometimes we have to be administrative workers. So understanding how all your identities within the research process or even within the therapeutic process affect the research and affect our identity. And then lastly, how are you able to intersect utilitarian and a social justice worldview? So I think the difficult thing with looking at both utilitarian and a social justice worldview is that we see them as separated. If we are one thing, we can't be the other. But in reality, we are both. We all operate within a paradigm of capitalism and other things, but we also have this motivation to have a social justice worldview. So how do we balance both of that and acknowledge that both those things can be true? Okay, so now we're going from action research to community-based participatory research. Action research, again, would be, I know we've discussed social theory, so the way I picture it, and maybe I should have presented a graph, is like, it's an umbrella after an umbrella. So then there's Habermas's social theory, and then there's critical theory, and now we're looking at action research, and then I then present a form of action research, which is community-based participatory research. So there's 4 umbrellas. So action research is the role of group to evoke change. So any type of, that's why it's an umbrella term, because you're using action to change a specific community to help it. Facilitating public discourse that does not perpetuate the status quo. So an important element of action research is, again, not looking at what we are researching, but how we are researching, and how we are researching in terms of whether we are perpetuating the status quo of how all research is being done. Again, I'd like to bring up, for example, critiquing the scientific method. That would be the golden standard of all of us. We try to look for empirical evidence, but then again, we have to question, what is the goal of why we need to utilize the scientific method? Research into its own practice, kind of just what I said, and research in which participants are also researchers. So I think that's a very important note, because it is a core value of both action research and community-based participatory research. It's about that lateral relationship with your participants in which they are not only participants, but part of the research process. And then finally takes place in an organization or community and has a direct impact on them. So I think a lot of the times when, and I'm guilty of it too as a researcher, we're kind of removed from the research process. We read research and then we critique it. But I think it's a whole different process when you're actually engaged with what is happening realistically when you are there, understanding how you are affecting the community or group you're talking about. And so from there we can move to community-based participatory research, and that involves having participants collaboratively evaluating their research process. So again, I think it takes the idea of including the participants on a deeper level by giving specific instruction as to how participants are part of the research process, and that includes evaluating the research process. This includes the design, data collection, and research questions. So just an example would be if I'm doing research about, for example, 12-step programs, and I have no idea about them, and I go in there thinking, oh, like I'm gonna talk about drugs and alcohol, but I don't understand that by doing that I could be triggering someone. So by understanding that data collection process, maybe triggering the participants is something I need to think about and figure out. So findings are usually applied to community concerns and takes into account communicative action into social practice to develop new understandings. So again, I want to go back to Habermas's social theory because it informs both action research and community-based participatory research, because the way you're going to have a lateral relationship with your participant is to be able to utilize that communicative action of understanding rationality in the sense of whatever I produce is not just going to be on the role of the researcher, but how shared meanings are formed through communicative rationality. Okay. So to go in deeper, I wanted to go back because, as I said, I used all the umbrellas and I just shared the parallels and the differences between action research. So now I'm going to utilize critical theory and community-based participatory research. Community-based participatory research is not the only form of action research, because I'm focusing on research in terms of what types. I'm just utilizing that as an example, but that is only one form of it. So critical theory, collective, self-reflective inquiry to improve rationality through collective action, which I just touched upon. One thing we do have to understand within critical theory is a boundary crisis, where social systems and life world intersect. As I mentioned in earlier slides, life world refers to the concept of the interactions we have that are free or at least separated from the power structures or social constructs that inform them. So one thing to think about within critical theory is, where does the social system stop and where does life world start, and understand how they interact with each other. And then the goal for critical theory is facilitating public discourse in social spheres to show that what has been working is not working. So with a lot of these constructs we see, again, we go back to instrumental rationality. There is this facade that things are working because they're accepted meanings and they're accepted social contracts within which we exist. But they're not working, and they're not working for some people that don't have the voice to talk about it. So I think with a researcher's role of adapted critical theory, that's something very important to think about. And again, to understand practice and praxis dialectically. A lot of the time, these practices are just accepted because that's what we do. But if we are to change what is not working, there has to be a discussion. And we go back to the idea of dialectics, of going back and forth until reaching consensus. And then research into one's own practice. And then finally, objective perspective are an unattainable standard of research. And I like to emphasize on this because a lot of the time we always say, oh, but that's the fact, or this is the research. But all research is somewhat subjective until proven wrong. So if we look at it from that lens, we don't strive to control what we are researching. We strive to keep uncovering what hasn't been discovered. And then with community-based participatory research, the core principles of it are power, privilege, research identity, and academic team composition. I think I've gone over all of them, but I do want to emphasize, I think what's really important about the theme of the presentation is power, and not only through the researcher-participant relationship, but even within our academic institutions, or how we exist, or even being at this conference. How does our positionality of power affect our work and how we present ourselves as a researcher and a therapist? And so the important thing about that is power sharing with our participants, cultural humility, and self-reflexivity around power, so around power dynamics. So being able to admit those power dynamics, even though we don't want to, or we want to hold on to them. Understanding how power is exerted in the construction of knowledge. Again, why are certain meanings or certain facts accepted as that? How does that affect how we engage with communities or even marginalized communities? And then the goal of community-based participatory research is a bi-directional educational process of empowerment, critical consciousness, and sustainability. So again, I've talked about the two, empowerment, which can be similar to emancipation and critical consciousness, but I think a really important concept with this is sustainability. Again, talking about what happens after you leave the community when you've participated in it. Are you just leaving the community because you're done with your research, or are you leaving them with the ability to sustain what you've done? And so again, from hierarchical relationships to circular democratic relationship is the goal of the relationship between researcher and participant within community-based participatory research. Okay, and then I think the last part, because I've covered a lot on the concepts of social theory, critical theory, action research, and community-based participatory research. And within these, I really wanted to highlight power dynamics and positionality. So in order to utilize the theme of this presentation of practice-based evidence, this now is almost like a checklist of how one can reflect on your own self of the researcher. So the first point is reflecting on the intersubjective nature of the research process. What is occurring between the researcher? What and how is being observed, and what is occurring within the participants? So again, it takes intersubjectivity to a whole new level, because a lot of the time we're thinking of the only relationship between research and participant. But how about the relationship between researcher and researcher, or participant and participant, or groups of that? So we have to be able to be reflexive and understand those relationships. And they're not going to be easy because, again, if we look back, what informs our social construct is who is right. There is no right in this situation. And then reflecting on whether the research process is happening in a dialectical space. Subjectivity does not negate intersubjectivity. So again, our own subjectivity of what we think doesn't mean our opinion or our perspective takes precedent over what happens intersubjectively. Recognizing what finding truth means in terms of being able to be revised and being part of one's individual consciousness. And then reflecting on the autonomy of systems versus the autonomy of life's worlds, not taking into consideration the practice that comes from the theory. So I think that's an important one, because for a lot of us, especially if we've gained our degrees in, say, clinical psychology or MFT, we utilize theory a lot. And sometimes when you apply that to practice, it doesn't always turn out the way we want it to turn out. And we don't always acknowledge the power structures that exist within the practices we do. So it's important to understand how our specific therapy affects our clients, not only the level of change, but how, for example, me using Bowen or something and my client not understanding that theoretical model because of their own cultural context. So really understanding on the autonomy of our clients versus the autonomy of, say, what we're learning. And then reflecting on whether one is trying to control the research versus using the research to educate. And so that's an important one for me too, because are we trying to reach a desired outcome because that's what we need, some sort of clarity, versus are we trying to educate the community to understand that certain voices need to be heard instead of me trying to reach a conclusion. And then understanding collaboration and intersubjectivity similar to the client-therapist relationship. So I did like the metaphor of how research can be parallel to the client-therapist relationship, especially in relationships where it's a collaborative relationship in terms of not the therapist having a directive role so much, but allowing the client's reality to inform what the therapist is saying and how they interact. And that can be parallel to research because it doesn't have to be the researcher having control of, oh, I'm gonna ask you questions without asking you how you're affected by the way I'm asking questions or the research process I'm using. And then lastly, reflecting on one's power and intersectionality in order to understand the role of the researcher, which I've emphasized a lot. So I think we're good there. But that is the end of my presentation. So if you have any questions, I am here. I'll just leave it on the last slide. Yes?
So I love this. The question that I'm having systemically is in my head, there's real limitations to our ability to change the research process, to ask those types of questions, because who's funding the research, who's publishing the research, and I think obviously this conversation is needed because even theoretically, when you think about what we do as clinicians, it's all impacted by this idea that we have to work within the medical model. We need to use evidence-based practices. We need to be able to tell insurance companies what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, etc. But in the review of the literature that you've done, have you seen anything about ways that we might be able to overcome those systemic barriers to being able to change the research process in that way?
Not necessarily, like I said, it's theoretical. There are examples in one of the articles I read, but it's more on a personal level versus a community level. So for example, a lot of what I read was, for example, in supervision, how are you being supervised? How are you changing the lens of who you're working with? Because even if you are working, for example, in a DMH or insurance space where you do have to do those practices, it's kind of, how is your mentor teaching you how to think? Versus like, oh, you need to do so-and-so intervention. It's like, how am I making you a better therapist to work with your client? Versus, okay, let's talk about interventions. But in terms of implementing this, I do think it's difficult because there is a very theoretical basis to this that is difficult to implement because of all the constraints. But the way I see it is more of, if we were to change the way we think about this, then maybe things will start to change.
Mm-hmm. And there's also lying a little bit.
Yeah, I was like, I'm not going to say that lying. It's framing. Yes,
I do this thing. It's kind of like simple, but in the ways that I can deconstruct or decolonize. When I meet with a client, I tell them, I have to work with insurance companies, and ask them if they want to use their insurance or not, and then really involve them in the process of diagnostics. That I don't want to see you, and I don't see you in this DSM manner. And if you're gonna use insurance, I have to. So at the end of my intake, you know, I ask them, is this the diagnosis that you wanna fit in, right? And that's, like, I can't tell you how much clients appreciate that. And the collaboration and involving them in the process.
Yes.
First of all, Justine, was an absolutely fabulous presentation.
Yes, it was.
It summarized in such a thoughtful and complete way. I want to make a statement of hope about, in response to your question. Actually, there's quite a bit of community-based research, collaborative research, and you know, you're going to find it certainly in family process, for instance, JMFT, which is a family. Also in qualitative research journals, and I'll just say something about the work that I did with my students at City College starting in '97. We did 4-hour qualitative interviews with families in homeless shelters in New York City. So Latinx, African American, and Afro-Caribbean, mostly single parent families. And you know, in terms of like the impact of that kind of collaborative approach, where we really come in and say right away, we don't know what your lives are. And I had a multiracial, multi-ethnic team of interviewers working with not just this white guy. And you know, we said, we're really coming to you to learn about your experiences with the idea of possibly, if you think it would be useful, building a program to support your resilience. And one of the things we heard from family after family, in terms of your distinction between instrumental and collect, was it was the first time anyone had asked them.
Yeah.
That they'd been through many, many social service interviews, the purpose of which was to determine whether they really needed to be in a shelter or not. And it often had sort of that quality of affect, like, well, why can't you stay with your mother or your mother-in-law? This kind of thing. And there was, the other thing that was so interesting, as we started to talk about the program that we were envisioning, which we then developed a multi-family, once-a-week program in the shelter, the families would inevitably say, we like this program, but it wasn't the program. It was the interview.
Yeah.
So the point is that this kind of community-based, collaborative, critical theory-based, approach is itself a therapeutic. Like the word therapeutic. It's a life-enhancing experience for people.
Yes.
You know, if you approach it that way, if you
Yeah.
approach it as I'm a learner, you're the teacher. You know what I'm saying? So I love this, and
Thank you.
look forward to talking with you more about this. Fantastic. So.
Yes.
I know there are 2 questions. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a comment to share. I was listening to Dr. Marcella Polanco. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with her work, but she came to a conference that I was at, and she was talking about finding the cracks. And so
Yes, I read that article, yes.
Yeah, so getting to know the system well enough that you can kind of exploit it, right? So
Yeah,
you can
right.
lie a little bit. And I'm only in my PhD program, so I haven't had a lot of time to really dive into that, but I'm just curious if there are ways that people have found to find those cracks and kind of exploit the system in ways that help get at this. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, for me specifically, like I said, from a person's perspective, it's a lot about the supervision for me because I worked in a DMH site where I had to, so I don't know how I feel about saying it, but it doesn't matter because this is what it's about, but really doing that paperwork but also not talking about that during supervision, really understanding how do I help this client in the way I need to.
Yeah.
And I feel bad saying that ethically because I know we're all held to an ethical standard, but I think what this presentation does is show how much accepted forms of ethics does not coincide with our own self of therapists' ethical values.
Right.
And I think part of the supervision is bringing this all up.
Yes.
So, then how do we choose modalities? How do we use them? And the probabilism ethic of what the insurance company, and that's been really helpful to newer therapists coming up to something feels bad, but they think they're wrong because it
Yes.
feels bad, and to be able to really bring that up.
Yeah.
Or sometimes the supervisor may not be on board with
Mhm.
this form of
Yes.
thinking,
Right.
and there's a mismatch.
Yeah.
Yes, good point.
Well, and as a fellow Californian, who works in the Medi-Cal, process, there are so many additional limitations that I think we experience within that system that I think other clinicians don't, and I don't know how private insurance works in different states and things like that. But I know Medi-Cal is kind of its own beast, and working with DMH, DBH, all the different systems of care in California, very.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. I know this is a personal experience, but I brought one of my really good friends, and she actually works for homelessness services. And we were talking about her interview process, if you wanted to speak more on it. But one question she always asks potential hires is like, what is the reason of homelessness?
Why do you think
do you want to
people-
share on why you? Because I think that also really talks about the process of like, if you're working with this community, how are you treating them, or how are you engaging with them? If you want to talk.
Yeah, I always ask the question, and I started asking this question when I was a direct client provider working with an agency, because when I was hiring case managers, I started to realize we weren't asking why they were interested in work. We would ask why they were interested in working in the homeless service fields, in the homeless sector, but we weren't really understanding when they were coming on why there was a lack of empathy. And so I started asking now in interviews, why do you think people become homeless?
Beautiful.
And that became my do or break question when they answered it. Because a lot of times when they were answering questions, that question, that's when I started to hear how they think about people that are experiencing homelessness. And that's when I started to get a lot of answers of like, well, sometimes people are too prideful to want to, and sometimes people are too prideful to go into the homeless, to go into homeless services. Or they would say things like, sometimes they just think they're better off on the street. Or most people are experiencing mental illness or substance abuse, which is not the case. And so it made me realize people are not thinking about the system itself and why people become homelessness. And as we know, living in California, people are aging out of housing because they're not able to work, and Social Security isn't enough for them to sustain housing. Just housing in general is really expensive. If people lose their jobs and they're living paycheck to paycheck, they fall into homelessness. And to then realize they don't understand the real reasons as to why people fall into homelessness, and to realize it's many factors and how they intersect. If you're coming to work for a homeless authority and you can't really even understand those factors, then you need to do some work, really understand the population, a very vulnerable population, because if you really think about it, the people experiencing homelessness are at the bottom of the barrel. They're invisible people. And so it really that's the question that now I ask to really understand, are these people really understanding who they're coming in to work for? Because we work for this population. That's pretty much where, so we were having this discussion yesterday.
It's really good.
Well, it's interesting just on that, when we started going to the shelters, there were all these advertisements in the shelter on the bulletin boards for parenting workshops or parenting training. And we started interviewing people, and they said, the last thing we need, they weren't going to these things because we're good parents.
Yeah.
We just don't have affordable housing.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know,
Exactly.
and our whole project started after Bill Clinton signed the Welfare to Work Act, which limited entitlements,
Right.
5-year total, 2 years at a time. So of course we interviewed people saying, what do you most need in order to support your moving into the workforce? What do you think they said?
An address.
Child care.
Yeah.
I haven't seen a video with clips of 10 people saying child care,
Yes.
child care, not
Yeah.
psychological
Exactly.
help, although they like the program.
Mm-hmm.
but what they need is like resources.
Exactly.
That's it.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So what's been coming up for me in all that we've been talking about is how we live in a capitalist system.
Yeah.
You know, and mental health is housed in that system.
Yes.
So all our paperwork, our insurance company, everything is predicated on that system. And here we are trying to push back and find these ways inwards to emancipate ourselves and, you know, by extension, clients, participants, you know, whoever else that we're coming into contact with. And it's a tough nut to crack. You know, how do we think about, you know, like the president, risk management, protective factors in a system that is predicated on blame and
Yeah.
profit?
Yeah.
You know, like school shooting happens. Oh, then suddenly people remember, oh, there's mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When in fact we can just reduce the access to guns.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like when we think about even suicide prevention, we don't think about, okay, what is the biggest mode in which suicide is happening, and then just take steps to prevent that. So how do we work towards emancipation in a capitalist structure?
I think that's why I emphasized on the awareness of power and positionality, because I know even me as a researcher, I'm guilty of, for example, writing a paper and saying, oh, I want this to be published or whatnot, and being able to acknowledge that. Like I think a lot of the time we try to present ourselves as, even as a therapist or a researcher, as, oh, I'm trying to help the community. But that motivation of you wanting some sort of status or privilege is also there.
Absolutely.
And we don't talk about that enough or normalize that enough, because I think I covered this where capitalism and, for example, social justice we see them as black and white. If we live in this society and have both, we obviously inhabit both.
Yeah.
So let's start talking about that. Let's start talking about how, oh, I do want some sort of status and privilege, but I'm going to admit it so we can work on it so that decreases, if that makes sense. And I think that's why I wanted to do this presentation.
I want to respond to you, Jayashree. I've been doing this a long time and struggling with insurance companies for a long time and struggling with wanting to be an ethical clinician for an equally long time. I decided to break the rules. And we didn't get support from the power structures in AAMFT. We were told that we were being unethical if we didn't acknowledge that we were seeing a couple or a family on an insurance form. I didn't do it. I saw individuals. I broke the rules. Now, is that because I'm a shrink and I have an additional level of power? Maybe, but I did it mainly because it's what I believed. It was my ethical core, and I couldn't go to work the next day if I was lying to myself. So the people that I was seeing, I felt my rationalization was they had paid for their health insurance and they were unlucky enough to come to me, and this is the way I do the work. And then I don't get hung up in diagnosis. Diagnosis is just a word anyway. Now what you do need to do is decolonize people's minds. I have many people come in to see me now and they're all into what's my diagnosis, and I'm like, lonely? Well, that's not a DSM diagnosis, right? So there's a lot that involved it, but I think one of the things we need to do is look at how our own professional bodies interfere with doing what it is you're saying.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
I just want to give a personal sense that really upset me, and I do very much, I appreciate what you said in a very articulate way, and you. Just yesterday, a former client of mine who has moved herself into such an incredible place, is being accused of things that I know she didn't do, and trying to find her a lawyer and donations for private divorces. And I'm talking to people, lawyers, and I've talked to CVS workers that say, you see them as supposedly progressive and whatever, and I thought of the question of what do you think the cause is, and I make my case that is much more down home than this about the context and how I know this person, and I can feel over the phone that, oh, this is a do-gooder social worker who isn't thinking objectively, and, you know, instead of, this is my analysis.
Yeah.
And it used, somehow, sometimes, you know, my advocacy works, but I'm struck with even folks that I feel are into the public interest. And we know that public interest people can be just, that I found myself feeling like I'd done something wrong. Or like, if only I'd said it differently, and maybe, but really coming across those ways of viewing clients and how they're in that situation, even from people who reportedly want to help.
Yeah.
And then I'm kind of labeled, and I've been in this field a long time, I'm older, those people, but there's like a patronization because I'm trying to help them see this other way. And I'm just saying that because there's this personal toll too, and I'm still at it, but yeah.
I hear you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.